Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. Our guest today is Cornel West. He's a professor of philosophy at Harvard University. He's also a professor emeritus at Princeton University, and he joins us from Princeton. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, dear brother.
Professor West, a week or so ago, George Floyd died under the knee of a police officer in Minneapolis. Since then, we've seen a wave of protest across the U.S., even beyond. We've seen that story before, but do you think it is different this time around?
There's no doubt. We have reached a turning point. You know, the greatest text ever written on American democracy was written by the great Frenchman intellectual Alexis de Tocqueville. He made two fundamental points. He said there must be citizens' power as countervailing power against state power, and that if there's ever revolutionary transformation in America, it will be owing to the vicious legacy of white supremacy. And that last long chapter of volume 1 of his classic, Democracy in America, what we're experiencing is precisely what de Tocqueville was pointing out. Namely, that when you talk about the long history of exploitation, of abuse, of oppression of peoples of color, especially black folk, in the making of American democracy, it can push over a threshold, and the anger and the rage flows, and the system cannot contain it. And a system that is unable to reform itself and speak to the root origins and needs of an oppressed people results in explosion. Now, of course, this is rebellion. This is not revolution at the moment. This is rebellion. But there'll never be enough police. There'll never be enough cannons. There'll never be enough military persons to generate the kind of legitimacy, to generate the consent of citizens when they view that status quo losing its legitimacy. And that's where we are now. And it's a very, very difficult moment and a very painful dilemma, because people are wondering, well, what do we do and where do we go? And that's a tough one, because if the reform is precluded, then you end up with explosion.
Right. What's so different this time around? Obviously, there's the fact that his death was caught on tape so vividly, but also maybe because the protests we're seeing are not only mainly by African Americans, but also by other people. This seems to have triggered something among many Americans from all walks of life.
Well, one is the quantity of the protests. The tremendous scope and breadth of all colors, all genders, all sexual orientations, all ethnicities, all religious identities in the United States. And that's a beautiful thing. There's a marvelous new moral and spiritual militancy in terms of peaceful protest, but it's also the intensity of it, day in and day out, the local organizing that's taking place, the coming together of groups that in the past would hardly talk, that are now struggling together, walking the streets together, going to jail together. Those are the two factors that make this very different. But also, I think that you got the pandemic. This is very important to keep in mind. You got massive unemployment, depression-like levels of unemployment owing to the pandemic. And then you've got the neo-fascists running things in a nation state. Donald Trump exemplifies rigidity. He exemplifies dogmatism. He exemplifies indifference. He exemplifies callousness toward people who are suffering. And when you have that kind of impasse, the violent explosions take place.
Right. Are you concerned that Donald Trump, as he's done before, might play the card of divisiveness, to put it bluntly, might play the race card and maybe ignite a kind of, I don't know if it's a racial war or a civil war? Are you concerned by that?
Well, I'm concerned that he's done that already. He's been doing that for the last 3.5 years, the vicious attacks on black citizens, on black athletes, on black leaders. My fundamental concern is that we're at a fork in the road, and we either go nonviolent revolution, the way Martin Luther King Jr. talked about it, in which there is a genuine democratic sharing of wealth, of resources, of status, and of respect. Or we go not just right-wing authoritarianism, but American fascist option. That's also new. The repression, there's always been examples of that in American history. But we are reaching a point now where you've got a real American fascist option out there with organized militia supporting Trump. And yes, that can lead toward more strife. It can lead toward ugly strife. And that's more than division. That's gangsterization. Right. That's where it could lead.
I want to read you a statement that came out just a couple of hours ago by former President George W. Bush. This tragedy in a long series of similar tragedies raises a long overdue question. How do we end systemic racism in our society? The only way to see ourselves in a true light is to listen to the voices of so many who are hurting and grieving. Those who set out to silence those voices do not understand the meaning of America. This coming from George W. Bush. Your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, it's good to see my fellow citizen and right-wing politician who, when he was in the White House, did not heed any of the calls that we had. How many marches did we have in front of his White House? I mean, it's interesting to see the various presidents all now coming out and speaking in this way, but each and every one of them, Bush, Clinton, Obama, right across the board, that they did not in any way address the systemic issues of police abuse, of police murder, and then the racist patterns of employment, housing, education, healthcare. They were all tied to Wall Street domination. They were all tied to the militarism of the State Department and the Pentagon. They allowed the 53 cents of every dollar to go to the military, so there was no resources to deal with the basic needs of the people, let alone deal with the racist patterns that are shot through the institution. So I appreciate the words, but it's much, much too late. And this is true for all of the former presidents. They all viewed themselves in the end as heads of an American empire that's predicated on a militarism abroad and the militarizing of the internal operation of the state and police, and then the wealth inequality of Wall Street, driven by Wall Street greed.
What about Obama? I mean, is the legacy of Obama Donald Trump?
Oh, no. I mean, a neoliberal is always better than a neo-fascist when it comes to a whole host of issues. But when it comes to hitting the issues of systemic racism, there's no accident that the Black Lives Matter movement emerged under the Black president with a Black attorney general, with the Black Homeland Security. Those Black faces in high places were too accommodated to Wall Street and the Pentagon to speak to the needs of poor and working people, especially Black poor and working people, and the hollowness now of the neoliberalism of Barack Obama becomes very, very, very clear. You hear that in the streets among the young folk. But it's not a matter of individual faults. It's a matter of he being head of an empire and not willing to speak to the needs of the people, but heeding the needs of Wall Street and State Department and Pentagon. That's right. The issue.
Donald Trump holding the Bible the other day. I know that's an issue, a religion that you're interested in. What do you make of that? Who is he speaking to?
Well, I mean, as a revolutionary Christian, you know, he's got Pharaoh's and Pontius Pilate's version of biblical religion. It's Constantine. You remember Constantine made Christianity a state religion and used Christianity as a tool to support the empire, to support structures of domination. Whereas for me, as a revolutionary Christian, I'm with the Jesus who was crucified by the Roman Empire. I'm with the Jesus who ran the money changers out of the temple. I'm with the Jesus that says, what you do for the least of these, you do for me. And the least of these are always orphan, widow, fatherless, motherless, oppressed, poor, workers, gays, lesbians, peoples of color, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, any people who are being marginalized in this way. And so I have a fundamental clash, but I expect that kind of hijacking of the prophetic religious practices of a Donald Trump, because again, heads of empire have done that all the way back to Constantine.
Right. Just the last question. You've lived a bit in France. We've seen a demonstration in Paris linked to what's happening in the U.S., also linked to a controversial death in the hands of the police. Do you think what's happened in the U.S. resonates, or the situation is totally different and there's no common thread there?
Oh no, there's marvelous human beings in France, just like there's marvelous human beings in the United States, anybody else who have integrity, honesty, decency, and generosity, who care about people who are catching hell in other parts of the world. And you have your own rich tradition of the French Revolution. We're not talking about the terrorism at the end. We're talking about those grand ideals of liberty for all, of brotherhood and sisterhood, of equality. France itself provides tremendous, made its own gift to the world in terms of overthrowing domination. And that tradition is still, I think, in some ways alive in France, more and more probably among the ex-colonized subjects, those who come in from Africa and Guadeloupe and Martinique, and trying to convince the French and the French government that they ought not be on the side of counter-revolution, but on the side of revolutionary change, non-violent revolutionary change, but revolutionary change in and of itself, which means France has to come to terms with its own white supremacy, with its own colonial legacy, with its own ties to big business, with its own ties to its former colonial countries as they attempt to move into spaces of decency and dignity.
Professor Cornel West, I want to thank you very much for being with us here on the France 24 interview, and thank you all for watching it. Stay tuned for more news.